Great. Okay, so I think we're good. So welcome. This is Kirsten with the Iowa Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and this is one of our webinar series on substance abuse issues. This one is on relapse prevention, and we have, once again, staff from the Integrated Service Project to present. I will let them each when it's their turn, they can do their presentation and present themselves and give all of the bio themselves. Can folks still hear me? Because I'm getting a message of audio quality being kind of screwy.
Oh, there was
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, but there was like a moment where you kind of faded out.
Where it dropped out? Okay. Well, then I'm going to proceed, because since I'm not going to be talking much anyway, I'm about to mute myself and hand the microphone over, if you will. So here I go.
Thank you, Kirsten.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Kirsten. So my name is Megan Jones. I'm with the Integrated Services Project. We are a special project under the Iowa Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We are the Integrated Services Project. We usually do a little bit of a chat about what our project is and our research, but we have so much ground to cover today, we're not going to talk very much about that. So if you are unfamiliar with the project, we have been working in Iowa since 2001. We started as a research project that actually started in 1997, and we looked at the co-occurrence of domestic violence, sexual assault, and substance use disorders. And started with that research project through the University of Northern Iowa, and then moved on to working across the state in different areas across the state, and having victim service agencies and substance abuse treatment agencies work side by side in education and collaborating services and providing services to the people in their community. My personal background is I started out in the field as an advocate, and then I have also done substance abuse counseling and also mental health counseling. And I'll let Barb talk a little bit about herself before I go forward.
Hi, I'm Barb Brindles, and I've been an advocate since 1993, so quite a long time. I've been working on the project ever since it started with the research in 1997, and hopefully I can share some things that I've experienced and learned along the way with you today.
Yeah, and we are completely, I know Kirsten said she would try to politely interrupt us. We're also fine with the rude interruptions. You will notice that Barb and I interrupt each other all the time. We've been working together for a long time. So we invite you to do the same. And I really want this information to be applicable to you and your work. So if you have a question that you don't understand what we're talking about, or you don't understand why this is important for you to know, or why we feel it's important for you to know, or just follow-up questions about, this is what's going on for me, and do you have any suggestions? We are happy to field anything like that, so please do ask. I know webinars are a little more difficult when it comes to asking questions, so I encourage you to ask away. So like I said, we started out as a research project in 1997. And we found that about 64% of domestic violence and sexual assault in Iowa programs had substance abuse problems. The women in Iowa programs also had substance abuse problems or dependency problems. And the national statistics for that is about 80%. So we feel that our stat is actually on the low side, simply because of how we did the research. We went into shelters at that time and outreach programs, asked clients to participate in the research, and then came back a few days later to actually do the interview. So we feel like those who had high dependency problems probably left the shelter during that time, and we were unable to capture those results within our research. And then conversely, in treatment centers, we found that about 90% of women in treatment centers reported domestic violence in their lifetime. So the co-occurrence, as I'm sure you know, is pretty high. And also this particular population has a lot of complex reoccurring problems. The lethality tends to go up in this particular population. And so shelter stays can be compromised due to cravings, triggers, withdrawal, and safety. Obviously, it's very complicated as well. So how can you as an advocate help? Of course, we have already, as Kristen mentioned, this is one in a series, and so we've already touched on some like assessment things, but certainly understanding and talking openly, screening, assessing, asking those questions about substance abuse problems without judgment, recognizing that this is a common problem. So of course you're going to ask, and letting the clients, by asking, you let your clients know that this is a safe place to talk about these issues. And then of course doing your own personal education about addiction and relapse and the basics of a relapse prevention plan, which we hopefully will be able to cover in today's talk. So what is relapse? I keep using that word, and I want us to all kind of have a basic definition of what that word means. Basically, when we're talking about in the context of addiction behavior, a relapse occurs when the person experiencing addiction or a substance use disorder resumes his or her addictive behavior after a period of abstinence. So I quit using, I'm working on my recovery, and then I resume using. That's a basic definition of relapse. However, it can also include folks that are trying to moderate their use. So let's say I don't want to quit my alcohol use completely, but I would like to moderate my use to 1 drink per day, and I'm able to do that for a period of time, and then I go on a weekend bender where on Saturday and Sunday I have 14 drinks each day. That would also be considered a relapse. It's a period of uncontrolled behavior. So, and I also really like this quote from Terry Gorski, who's kind of a leader in the addictions field. Relapse is more than just using alcohol or drugs. It is the progressive process of becoming so dysfunctional in recovery that self-medication with alcohol or drugs seems like a reasonable choice. So as we're talking about relapse, relapse is very complex. It is not just the absence of use and then suddenly we're using again. There's a lot of different stages and parts to it. So looking at the stages of relapse, and again, the reason that we want to kind of in-depth talk about what relapse looks like is because it is so complex, and it's not, and it also can mirror experiences of trauma when you're either going through a traumatic event or being in an abusive relationship, but also as you're trying to heal from trauma as well. So it can be very, very difficult to tease out what exactly might be going on for your client. So the first stage, those experiencing the first stage are not really aware of the danger, and they have no idea that they are in trouble, but people around them might notice subtle changes in attitude and behavior. And the best way for me to verbalize this is I had a client that would say, if when I wake up in the morning, if I'm not working on recovery, I'm working on relapse. So during that first stage, some of their recovery efforts might not be attended to. So let's say part of their recovery is that they go to meetings and they're exercising and they're getting to work on time and they're showering and taking good care of themselves, or counting to 10 before they yell at their kids, whatever that might be, and hopefully not yelling at their kids. And maybe some of that is they're not attending to those things as much as they were before. And then so it may not be something that's blatantly like, oh, wow, they're about to relapse. It's just they're not doing the things that they would normally do in their recovery. The second stage, people often become restless and irritable, discontent, and the focus shifts from what I can work on myself, my internal process, to the external process. And they start focusing on other people. So distorted thinking can occur. Often this results in anger, pushing away, fear, and this can also mirror what trauma experiences, people with trauma experiences as well. So for instance, during that second stage, they may be pushing away their help. They might be saying like, well, that group didn't fit me and I just don't like it, so I'm just not going anymore, or I don't want to call my counselor, they don't really understand me anyway. And that can happen with trauma response as well. I remember one woman that I worked with that she had a pretty explosive incident with her abusive husband, and the family was involved. So her family was trying very hard to help her get to a safe place and help her get the support that she needed. And after a week or two of that, suddenly she was really pushing away the help and her family and talking about, well, you were the ones that called the police on him, and you don't understand my marriage, and you don't support me in my marriage, and really being defensive of the abuser. So that distorted thinking can, instead of placing the blame on the abusive behavior, placing the blame on the family. So the distorted thinking also can play out when it comes to trauma. And then third stage of relapse, this is where a lot of like the negative feelings, the isolation occurs. So if I've pushed away my help and I've pushed away my supportive people in my second stage, and then some of these unresolved feelings, either it could be about trauma, could be about the shame related to addiction, those feelings start to bubble up. And now I don't have that support system or that recovery plan that I had before in place. So this often results in isolation. Negative attitudes or compulsive behavior can dominate what's going on. And then also magical thinking tends to surface. And magical thinking in the recovery field is thought of like, well, maybe I really wasn't addicted, or I can handle myself if I just have one glass of wine, or I just smoke just a little bit. I'm really different from the others in A, and I can just really handle it. I'm just so stressed right now. I think I can do it. And so as you can see, that decision process is starting to click in. Like they're already making the decision that I'm going to use because I think I can handle it. And then that fourth stage, basically what happens is life. Life happens, and boom, it's an excuse to use. So, and it could actually be a crisis that happens, or it could be something that they initiated so that they can rationalize that return to use. An example that I use, and I'm not betraying his confidence, my husband knows that I use him as an example with this. My husband was a smoker for many, many years, and it took many, many years for him to quit smoking. And a good example of fourth stage would, he would talk about, he'd go through that few days of magical thinking of maybe I could have one cigarette and throw away the rest of the pack, and I think I can handle it. And then driving home from work, he would, get himself kind of worked into that, like, well, I deserve it, or I need it, and come home and pick a fight with me. And it would be a ridiculous fight, like, you didn't pick up your socks or whatever. And I'd be like, what's going on? Why are you fighting? And then boom, out the door, go buy the pack of cigarettes, come home, feel so ashamed. Why did I do that? I'm so sorry. And why can't I just quit? And so it's like this cycle of what happens. And then also, of course, life just happens, death happens, crises happen. So it can be, again, another, even though the decision has already been made, it's kind of the excuse to use. This process, these stages are not necessarily linear, and people can speed through these stages really fast. It could be a really long, drawn-out process, like that first stage where they're not working towards, they're not making the decision to use, but they're also not really working on their recovery. That too can be weeks, months, even years sometimes. People call that like the dry drunk scenario. So I don't want you to, and also, again, like some of this is outside of a person's control, right? Crises happen. And so learning how to manage crises without using can be really difficult. And depending on the situation, it's up to her whether or not that's the time where she relapses, or that's the time where she builds a better recovery plan. So like I said, like relapse, like addiction is a process. And while I've been focusing mostly on the emotional and social part of relapse, there's also a physical part that's going on at the same time, particularly when we're talking about early recovery within the first year or two of recovery. We won't go too much into this process, but as you know, alcohol and drugs affects the pleasure center of our brain, and it pumps out a lot of hormones such as dopamine into our system. And so when we synthetically supply that into our system, into our bodies all of the time, our bodies stop producing dopamine on its own. And when we remove that synthetic source through alcohol and drugs. When we're in recovery and we stop using, our brain is not producing the dopamine it needs to feel happy. And so we feel really crappy, we feel really depressed, and then also we feel these physical cravings towards use. So not only are you battling kind of that emotional social process to relapse, you're also battling the physical cravings as well. So before even discussing a relapse prevention, if you're working with someone who that you have talked with them about their substance use, you know that they're working towards recovery in whatever pathway, that whether it's treatment or AA or any other pathway that they might be looking at, it's really good to talk with them about, first of all, what are some signs that you may be considering relapse or that you have relapsed. I've had clients give me really specific things that I may not have looked for had they not told me, such as like, well, I stopped showering and I stopped taking care of my hair. And that, okay, that's really concrete. I can look for that and follow up with you. And then also asking about their support system. Like, do you have a sponsor or a sober support system or a sober person in your life that you can talk to? Sometimes, depending on how far progressed the addiction is, they may not have anyone in their life that is sober and doesn't use, or how progressed their isolation is with their abusive partner. What meetings can you go to, such as treatment, AA, Celebrate Recovery, Smart Recovery? Who can you call when you're craving? And then learning more about their specific physical, emotional, cognitive, environmental, and cues of risk for them to relapse and how to deal with it. And then also specifically in shelter, as we know, shelter can be very chaotic. So shelter advocates can talk specifically about that environment, like how can I be supportive in this particular environment? And when other people are using in shelter, that can be really hard for someone in recovery to be around someone who's using. And these 5 important factors to consider basically are potential triggers. So if they're not really able to identify some specific things that we talked about on that previous slide of who are support people or what does it look like when I might be relapsing, you can talk to them about these specific triggers, and that will help you kind of narrow down like what are some potential risks to you relapsing. So exposure to any person, place, feeling, situation where we've used drugs or alcohol or experienced emotional trauma. In the 12-step field, the saying goes, if you go to the barbershop enough times, you'll eventually get a haircut. So if you continue to go to the bar, even though you're trying not to drink, eventually you might have a drink because you're in an environment where you used to drink and there's alcohol around and everybody else is pretty much drinking. So looking for those kind of cues, or a house where you used to buy drugs or use drugs. So frequent, yeah, go ahead.
Just to jump in on that too, I think as advocates, when we know that the person has to go to court and face their abuser, or something's coming up like going home to a family get-together where your childhood abuser is, or something like that, when facing those kinds of re-traumatic events, to talk to someone about, how can they deal with this without using, how can we get you through this situation without using. So
right, so essentially it's like including a relapse prevention plan with your safety plan. So if you're used to planning with someone around their safety in those situations where they're going to be around a childhood abuser or they're going to court or whatever, include and how can we make sure that you're safe and you protect your recovery while you're in those situations. Absolutely. Thank you, Barb. So the frequent exposure to high-risk situations where they've used in the past, and then, of course, cravings, recurrent thoughts, physical desires to use drugs or alcohol. And I would also include in there using dreams. That's a really common experience for people in recovery, that they dream that they've been using and they feel high or drunk in the dream, and they wake up and they are so sure that they were injected or given something to drink in their sleep, because that high just felt very, very real within the dream. And I've even had clients come to me and say, I know my UA is going to be dirty because I dreamed it, and it wasn't dirty at all. So the brain is a really amazing thing, that it can release that amount of dopamine in a dreamlike state. And then conversely, trauma dreams. We know many people that have experienced trauma have dreams of recurring dreams and nightmares. So that can be a trigger to use as well. Inadequate living skills, and then to deal with personal conflict or negative emotions, and then inadequate skills to deal with social pressure to use substances. And just looking over these triggers, I can see how there are some things that may be within her control, and there are many things that are not. So it's that, again, is the importance of having and the high likelihood of all of these things happening. So it's the importance of having advocates involved to help safety plan and recovery plan at the same time, because these can be a daily occurrence, all of them. And also thinking of recovery just by itself, like if you were to take out the trauma experiences, recovery is a very complex thing, and it's very personalized, and it takes a long time. The journey, people often think of recovery as like a destination, but really it's the journey, it's the path. And then when you include something as complex as trauma, then we just increase the overall complexity of the recovery journey and path. And she alone will determine what's most important in moment to moment, what's most pressing to me right now. Is it my safety or is it my recovery? And so giving her tools to if it is my safety right now, then here are my safety plan things that I can do, and if it is my recovery, here are some things that I can do to work on my recovery, because both of these things are so interconnected and working forward as far as recovery is concerned. And the stages of recovery, I kind of giggle when I read through these, because this seems like a very tall order we're asking people to do. And like the bottom thing, to successfully recover, she must master all 6 of these stages, which again speaks to how recovery is a journey. And I look at this and think of myself and think, wow, I'm still on my own journey for some of these things too. But stopping using drugs, alcohol, or engaging in addictive behavior, that obviously is that kind of first part of recovery. And that can take, most people in recovery say the first year to 2 years is the most intense. And when they're just focusing on day-to-day, I can't use today type of thinking. Replacing addiction-centered living with a recovery-focused living, and engaging in relapse prevention. Tackling those addictive and compulsive behaviors, and replacing addictive thinking with rational and sober thinking. Learning to identify and manage emotions, and then change the self-defeating core beliefs about ourselves, others, and the world. And I'll switch it over to Barb.
Thank you, Megan.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that was a lot. Does anybody have questions about that so far? Anything there? Nothing?
I know, it's a lot to digest.
So how can advocates help with relapse? So to me, that the thing about helping a person is, as an advocate, is talking about their trauma. But we can also remind them about how to have, how to pay attention to their relapse plan. We can help them develop a relapse plan, or prevention plan, excuse me, not a relapse plan. So a good relapse prevention plan would include the biological things, the psychological things, the social things, and the spiritual things. All elements of a good prevention plan. So if it's appropriate, you can have a conversation with someone, you know, by just being very sincere and without judgment, and asking, you know, if it's important, if they feel it's important to be sober or to stay sober. You know, if the answer contains a lot of buts, or I'm not sure I can do it right now, or I'd have to give up my friends or whatever, you can reinforce that, you know, it's worth it, that you are worth it, and then also talk about the difficult journey that sobriety is, but that believing that you can do it, and knowing how hard it is, can really help you prepare for it. The opposite question that inspires introspection. Wow, that's quite a word. What would happen if you returned to using? So you can talk about the consequences. A lot of times as an advocate, I noticed that I was working with women who had children involved with CPS. And so I know many of you have folks that are involved with CPS, and so not only working on the trauma, but also thinking about what's the consequence if you'd return to using. You know, we've been working on trying to get your kids back, and giving up and returning to use isn't going to help. That's definitely a long-term consequence. And CPS, you know, often will just take their kids and give them to somebody, a foster family, who is willing to take care of them. So, and we don't have much time, especially if they have little ones, right? They have about 6 months to straighten up, and that's kind of difficult. So talking about those consequences is important. The emotional consequences, the physical consequences of their health, things like that we can talk about. If it's appropriate, you know, discuss the abuser drawing you back into that relationship. And a lot of times, if drugs and alcohol is part of that relationship, the abuser will use the fact that he's able to get some drugs for you, or try to lure you back by taking you to the bar or to a party, or inviting you to a friend where to a place where they're going to use drugs. And those kinds of things lure people back all the time, back into the relationship. And unfortunately, the relationship is so much more dangerous when there's drugs and alcohol involved. So, so that's our other concern also, right? That the danger level goes up and the lethality goes up for them. So, and also returning to a dangerous group of people. A lot of times there's risky people involved in the drug culture, or involved in the bars, and so just talking about the dangers of being involved with people who are dangerous for one way or another to us, and the health, the repercussions of our health, or the legal system, or CPS, as I had mentioned earlier. Problems at work. So, you know, a lot of people have problems at work if they have drug and alcohol problems. So trying to get your life on a straight and narrow is difficult if you can't go to work and keep a regular kind of schedule in your life. And that it does not help with your self-esteem. So talking about self-esteem will always help someone to come back from using. So ask women what's on the top of her relapse list. What are the warning signs for them? Every person has their own warning signs, and so it's appropriate to list them in order and talk about them. So when you withdraw, what do you feel like you do? Well, like this example is, I begin thinking no one loves me except my abuser, and that he's right, that I'm worthless, or that I'm a X, Y, and Z, and so I might as well just stay with him because I can't find anybody else that's worthy. Or contemplating going back to the people that you were using with, or the abuser that you used with. If you're starting to hang around those people again, you're eventually going to fall back into using drugs and alcohol, right? And you're going to be around drugs and alcohol, which is a number 3. So, or maybe a lot of times what I noticed is women that I work with, maybe they're going to go find a job and they want to work in a bar, but they were an alcoholic and they're trying not to drink. That's really not going to work, right? So they're walking right back into that environment where drugs and alcohol are. Number 4 is not going to where you're getting support. So maybe you're not going to your support group, or you're suddenly dropping out of your support group, or you're not going to AA like you had been, or you've been missing appointments. I could always tell when people were falling off and relapsing because they wouldn't show up for their appointments. And in the past, they had been showing up all the time. So I could kind of tell. So talking with women about their warning signs helps them and us. So if they're missing their appointments, do you want me to call you and see how you're doing? You know, you can get some of those ideas for how to support them in that way. And make sure that celebrations, and what I've said before, are devastating events such as going to court or facing your abuser is talked about, and how can we do those things, how can we get ready for those things without slipping back into relapse. And that person would be able to tell you, well, this is what I tend to do, blah, blah, blah. So advocates can ask a person for how to identify each problem. They can list some action things that they can do to prevent the problem from expanding or getting worse. Like I was saying earlier, one of the things they could list maybe is to reach out to an advocate, or start coming back to support group or something like that. It is important to make sure that the solutions are specific, achievable, time-related, so very measurable. So if I stop coming to support group, I need you to call me the next day to see what is happening, and then I need to come in within the next few days to meet with somebody and talk about what's happening or what's going on with me. So that it's something that's achievable. So if they're clear out in a rural area where it's hard for them to get to you, it's not going to be very achievable, right? So how can each person work that out for themselves, and how can we be part of that assistance? So here's just the beginning of a list that you could help the person make. So with one idea might be is that if I'm withdrawing from people, my action plan can be that I can go to AA to challenge my beliefs that I'm worthless. I can visit a person who shares my faith or who inspires me, or I can call a non-using friend, or, you know, if a lot of times people come out of treatment and they have someone who is their recovering buddy, or a sponsor of some type, maybe they can call them, and then you continue to list different things that might come up, and then what can be the solution around that. So, and then ask them what resources that they have identified that are available for them. There is an AA meeting today at noon and one at 8 p.m. and I'll go to both of them because I'm really struggling today. And I can call Sally tomorrow. She's been a longtime friend who always accepts me no matter what I do. I can visit my church on Wednesday night and stay for social hour, so I stay around stay busy and stay around people that can support me. And by the way, it's time specific, as you can see, and it's very achievable. And someone who's in relapse or recovering, especially newly in recovery, they really need to keep a busy schedule. If they're in shelter, one of the things that you can do to help them is really create a schedule where they're going to keep busy most of the time, and they have specific things they're going to go do, like go to groups or go to a social hour or something like that, or go for you know, even exercise or a yoga class or something to keep busy the whole time. The more time they have sitting and being lonely is going to lead them back into relapse.
And one thing I would mention here too, Barb, is that one thing I've noticed when talking about advocates about being really specific like this, like I'm going to go to a meeting at this time and this time, advocates I've noticed have expressed some concern that I don't want to be another controlling person in their life, and I don't want to be the person who sets up their plan that fills their entire day. And what I would say is to that is that, first of all, it's not you setting up the plan, you're just assisting them, right? So you're being supportive and asking them, well, how are you going to spend your time, and what are your ideas, and did you know, and here's some resources in case they didn't know that, you know, these meetings were available. So you're working with her, not for her, to set up this plan. And as Barb mentioned, particularly in early recovery, structure is incredibly important. And that's why treatment programs look the way that they do. If you go to a treatment program, like you eat from this time to this time, and it does feel like from the trauma advocate part of me, it's like, wow, this feels really controlling and weird. But it's shown, research has shown that having that structure in their days full, at least initially, is really, really helpful. So that they don't get bored, they don't get lonely, they don't start acting on those impulses and cravings to use. So,
yeah. And one thing, you know, you can always say as an advocate is if these things don't work out this time, it doesn't mean it's a failure. It just means that you're going to learn from it and try again. So, you know, because that self-esteem, as we all know, is very important for not only the person who's lived through a lot of trauma, but on top of that also has struggles with substance abuse, and they really have, it really does affect their self-esteem. So that's always something we can always work with anyone, right? So specific things about their biological or physical aspects is encouraging people to get a physical checkup, to, you know, if they haven't been doing this, if they didn't go to treatment, a lot of times they do this in treatment, but if they didn't do it in treatment, they can go to somewhere and get a hepatitis or STD screening, just to make sure that, you know, they're going to be okay, maybe a Hep C test, so that they physically know how they're doing. Sometimes people in recovery, you know, haven't, people, I mean, that are using substances have missed doctor's appointments and physicals and things like that for years and years. So even just getting their teeth, you know, checked out, some of these things just is something that we can encourage. Drinking alcohol and drugs for an extended period of time can severely interfere with the intake of important nutrients and vitamins. So, and especially vitamin B, and they, you know, also it says after the age of 40 that we often lack vitamin B12. So it's a really good idea to encourage taking a multivitamin, eating healthier foods, trying to look at your diet, and eating more vegetables and fruits, things like that. Maybe even going and seeing a dietitian, you know, to see how they can eat healthier and receive more of that vitamin D being out in the sun more or taking some kind of supplement is important. Physical exercise also is very good. It releases that feel-good chemicals in the brain. The endorphins can be decreased when people are stressed or have been using for a long period of time, like Megan had said earlier. So physical exercise is one way to get endorphins coming back in their brain, and also improve their immune response in their body. So, and regular quality sleep. You'd be surprised, but that people in new recovery need a lot of sleep, and so they might need to take naps. And we might not like it if people are taking naps in the middle of the day in shelter, but it may be important for them to recover. So when they're not sleeping well at night, and they may be having a lot of anxiety or depression, which are all triggers. So taking something to help you sleep might be helpful, or handouts about how to sleep in a better way might be helpful. So sometimes they, say put lavender under your pillow, or maybe just taking what is it called, melatonin or something like that. Is that right, Megan?
Yeah.
Something that's a natural medication that can kind of help. It may be helpful or necessary also to discuss the trauma nightmares. For example, what Megan was talking about earlier, about having using dreams. Many women that I worked with, their trauma nightmares and their using dreams would all be closely linked. And so if they had a trauma nightmare, they would feel unsafe. Maybe they would come to wake up very shocked and very anxious, and then they maybe feel that euphoria from the using part of the dream. And so sleeping is a very difficult thing for someone with all of these issues. So especially being able to talk about it with their advocate or with a counselor or something, to be able to make sense of their dreams and be able to deal with them in a healthier way. So compliance with medication that is legitimately prescribed and not taking more or less than they're supposed to is an important thing for someone to think about, especially someone who was addicted to prescription meds. And so how can they talk to their doctor about having medication that is not addictive, for one thing? Can they talk to their doctor or their psychiatrist to change their meds, or maybe paying attention to how they feel on their medication and talking to the doctor right away instead of being irritated and just putting up with feeling bad because the medicine isn't working. Those are all important things for them to think about. So, and you can always encourage them as an advocate to call your doctor right away and talk to them about how you don't like this medication instead of just stopping using it. For example, people on any kind of depressants or antidepressants do not want to just stop immediately. They need to taper down, and so it's real important to talk to your doctor about how you're going to taper down, or at least continue to take it until you go to the doctor. Some medications need 30 days to work within your body, so all of those things need to, be considered, and people will get frustrated and just quit right away. And that doesn't really, that's not really very helpful for them. So it's not uncommon to hear people who have relapsed to question their medication. So I started feeling better, but then I don't think I need it anymore. So, so a lot of people get that feeling like, I'm feeling really good now, I don't need this medication, and it's really the medication that's helping them feel better, right? So it does seem to be helpful to talk to women about calling their doctor again and trying something different. And I've already mentioned the antidepressants, so we can go on to the next slide.
Okay. So yeah, when it comes to the psychological aspect of recovery, we know that in the treatment field, we know that co-occurring disorders, so that would mean a substance use disorder with a mental health disorder, is a very high occurrence. That happens a lot. And then also in the trauma field, we know that victims often suffer from anxiety, depression, acute distress disorder, or PTSD, and other sort of responses to their trauma. So when you add both of them together, now we have a big mess of psychological issues that can occur. So it's just really highly probable. And sometimes I think we get stuck when we look at psychological things like mental illnesses. We get stuck in this chicken and the egg kind of scenario, like did the mental illness come first and then they started self-medicating with substances, or the mental illness was first and that made them more vulnerable to being a victim. But really, in the moment, it kind of doesn't matter what came first because it's all happening for her right now, right? So you may want to consider consulting with a psychologist or a psychiatrist or licensed social worker. And it's really important to, as you know, of course, in the trauma field, we want to find a counselor that is trauma-informed and knows their stuff when it comes to childhood experiences of abuse, domestic violence, and sexual assault as an adult, but also when it comes to recovery and substance abuse. So do not assume that every mental health counselor knows about substance use disorders. As someone who worked in the substance abuse field, in the mental health field, I was really surprised at how mental health counselors, if they're just classically trained, don't spend a ton of time talking about substance use disorders. It's, of course, part of the DSM-5, but they may not have a very good understanding of substance use disorders or what recovery looks like and how that's a long process. So there is, if you're not aware, there is a certification in the state of Iowa to be a certified alcohol or drug abuse counselor. So you can look for therapists that have both, like a mental health certificate or licensure, and then also the substance abuse certification too, so that you know that they have a good understanding of both. In the social arena, when it comes to recovery and relapse prevention, loneliness and isolation is a major, major trigger for a lot of people. That's what we've already mentioned as far as keeping folks busy. And then we also know that loneliness and isolation is often identified as being a reason why people go back to an abusive partner. So it affects both kind of the safety and sobriety aspect of things. So it's really important to encourage social activities, both structured and unstructured. So some structured social activities might be taking a class or volunteering. If they've got children, going to a play group or going to story hour every week and meeting other parents. And then, of course, the unstructured, like phoning a friend, is there a sober friend, or even being in a place where there's people, like taking a walk at the mall or someplace where she feels safe, or of course going to meetings, so that they can feel connected with a social community and they're not quite as isolated. And of course, making amends, we hear about that a lot in like a 12-step recovery process, but it is, even if you don't follow 12 steps, usually in both tracks of, if I'm someone who has used substances, I may have burned a lot of bridges with family members and friends that I used to have a healthy relationship with. And then also in the field of if I had an abusive partner, so I may have, those bridges may have been burned because of what my partner did to isolate me, or just I decided to stay with them and my family didn't understand, and so we disconnected. So encouraging women or clients to start rekindling some of those relationships. and start identifying kind of how the shame and secrets have damaged those relationships and caused them to disconnect with healthy family and friends. I should mention too. You don't necessarily want to reconnect with folks that were unhealthy for you. Spiritual, and I see that we have about 9 minutes left, so I'll try and get through this as quick as I can. But the spiritual aspect of recovery is really, really important, and I want to make sure that we all have a good understanding of what I'm talking about and what the recovery field is talking about when they talk about spiritual. So spiritual is not pushing any sort of religion, and of course as good helping professionals, we would never want to push our own beliefs or religions onto anyone else. But the basic understanding of this is the connection with myself, what I believe, what I value, and then a connection with something larger than myself. So that, and often in 12-step, that's referred to as a higher power. So that connection with something larger than myself, it could be God, it could be a community, just the community at large. It could be nature. It could be being connected with the cosmos, looking up at the stars and feeling really small and realizing that you're connected, a being with all of this. It could be as simple as, in AA, they say, your higher power might be the group of people in this room right now, or your connection with your family. I had one woman that when she talked about her higher power, she would think of her grandmother. And that doesn't mean that she treated her grandmother as a god or a goddess. It was just that she felt that love, that unconditional love and that connection with something bigger than herself when she thought of grandmother. So that's what I'm talking about when we're talking about spiritual health and when we're talking about recovery. And the substance use process often damages that relationship with something larger than yourself, or that damages that relationship with self. And then, of course, trauma experiences damage that relationship with self too, because she's been told for so long that, you're nothing, you're worthless, you're nothing without me, and all of those, that emotional abuse type stuff. And then also going along with that, we all know, and I won't spend too much time on this, that there's that conundrum of, if she's trying to get safe and away from her partner, that her religious community might be saying to her that the marriage is more important and you need to work on that. So there's a book referenced here that for Christian communities that might be helpful when facing that particular conundrum. So finding that, as far as steps to helping her find that path home to the self, of course, you want to always place the importance on what's meaningful to her, not necessarily what you think is meaningful, but what is meaningful to her. And then making concrete action steps to help her connect with herself and with that larger sense of self. So discovering her own thoughts and beliefs may help her to find a way to a healthier place that ultimately supports both sobriety and safety. So here's some examples of things, and of course this is a short list, and I'm sure you can come up with way more things with her, but experiencing nature might be one way to connect with something bigger than yourself, helping others, making connections with animals, praying, meditation, yoga, going to spiritual activities. All of the arts also is a way of connecting with self and something bigger than yourself. So music, playing music, the art itself, writing, telling your own story, poetry, all of that can help with the spiritual side of recovery. And then the overall goal, obviously, is improving relationships with yourself, improving relationships with healthy family members, improving your relationship with a higher power in the community of people that surrounds the self. And I'll let Barb finish it out.
Advocates should have these kinds of things on hand in your office or in your to-go briefcase or whatever it is that you carry around with you when you meet with people. Have brochures on substance abuse treatment. Have a list of AA and NA meeting times. You can get them right off the web. There's other support group options. If there's a lot of religious communities that have some kind of celebrations group or some kind of thing like that. There's online resources for substance abuse and trauma. The information on substance abuse and how it affects the brain and the body is always good. You can get free posters from the CDC websites or the SAMHSA website, so SAMSHA, is that right, Megan?
I forget it every time. SAMHSA, I think.
Okay.
Something like that, yeah.
and you can order posters, they'll send them to you for free. To have a poster in your room that it talks about how substances affect the brain and the body. And I remember one time a woman said very clearly to me that the most important thing she ever owned was her brain. No one can take that away from you, right? Listing a listing of substance abuse or trauma-informed counselors, like Megan was saying, a lot of times there's counselors that are just classically trained and they really are not specifically trained on trauma or on substance abuse. So having a good list around to hand out to folks is important. And then other things you consider is that person can consider while they're struggling with these things is just removing any substances or paraphernalia from where they live is a good way to get started. Ask a doctor again for non-addictive medications. Learn to have more healthy parenting skills or how to develop safe and sober friendships. Learn more about physical, emotional, cognitive, environmental, and other cues that have a risk for us and how we plan to deal with it.
And that's all.
So if you want more information, you can always get a hold of us. There's our emails and also our website. And as Kirsten mentioned, you can always look at the other webinars that we've had on their ICADVA YouTube website.
Yeah, is there any questions before we go? We've got like 2 minutes, so we'd be happy to field any questions, and you can certainly email us too afterwards if you'd like.
Okay, it's Kirsten. I'm waiting and I'm not seeing anything come up, so
Just must have covered it.
Yeah. You fit it all in.
Yeah.
There will be, once this webinar ends, there will be a survey, evaluation survey that should pop up for you. It'll also be included in the follow-up email that you'll be getting. Please, of course, do that. As you know, a lot of our funding for all of us is tied to doing evaluations and showing that what we're doing is useful for people. So please take a look at that when you get it. And
yes, and we absolutely read your suggestions and make changes. So if there is something that we can do to make this better for the future presentations, please do let us know.
okay, well, thank you, everyone, and we'll hopefully catch you in November for the next one. And what's the topic of the next one?
The next one is how to build relationships in the community
Perfect.
with substance abuse treatment.
Great, perfect.
Okay.
So, and thank you, Megan. Thank you, Barb. Oops, I just got a hand raise, or maybe not.
And they quickly lowered their hand.
And they quickly lowered their hand. Okay, fair enough.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming and yeah, like Kristen said, carving some time out of I know you all have very busy schedules, so thank you for your dedication to this work and improving your services for women and men that have both substance use disorders.